There are moments in life that feel completely ordinary right up until the second they stop being ordinary forever. You're out in the woods on a crisp autumn morning, coffee in hand, laughing with your best friend about something ridiculous, and everything feels exactly the way it should. The birds are carrying on in the treetops, the cold air is sitting in your lungs like something clean and real, and the whole world feels wide open and unhurried. You're not thinking about danger. You're not thinking about anything heavier than what you're going to eat for dinner that night. You're just there, in the moment, completely at ease. And then something happens. Maybe it's a sound. Maybe it's a feeling. Maybe it's something flying past your head so fast that your brain doesn't fully register what it was until a few seconds later. And by the time it catches up, by the time the reality of what just happened snaps into focus, everything has changed. That ordinary morning has become something you will spend the rest of your life thinking about. Something you will replay in the quiet hours, turning it over and over, looking for the moment where things could have gone differently. The moment where a different choice, a different step, a different second might have led to a very different ending. The stories we're sharing with you tonight are exactly that kind of story. They are accounts from real people, ordinary men and women who went out into the world expecting nothing more than a regular day, and who came home carrying something they never bargained for. Some of them came home carrying fear. Some of them came home carrying grief. Some of them came home carrying questions they still haven't been able to answer, even after all these years. And the ones who didn't fully understand what they had survived. Those are the ones that stay with you the longest. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of a close call isn't the moment it happens. It's the moment, weeks or months or even years later, when you finally understand exactly what you walked away from. When you realize just how thin that line really was, the line between your story having a next chapter and your story simply stopping. Tonight, we have 5 accounts that all, in one way or another, live in that unsettling space between the ordinary and the unthinkable. From the deep woods of Ohio to the war-torn streets of a besieged city. From the jungles of the Congo to the quiet back roads of rural Arkansas. These are stories about the things we don't see coming. About the things that find us when we least expect them. And about the strange, fragile miracle of making it home when so many others didn't. So if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome, we are so glad you're here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join our community, because you will not want to miss what comes next. And for those of you who have been with us a while, settle in, get comfortable, and let's get into it together. More than 30 years ago now, back during the hunting season of 1992, a man named Josh and his best friend drove out to Belmont County with one simple goal in mind, to bag themselves a couple of wild turkeys for Thanksgiving. The storyteller was 22 years old at the time. Josh was 23. Both of them worked in a mill down in Wheeling, West Virginia, one of them on the line, the other hauling scrap. The pay wasn't exactly generous, but it kept the lights on and the fridge stocked, which was all you could really ask for. And since they both worked a 4-on, 4-off rotation, it gave them plenty of breathing room to get out into the woods once hunting season rolled around. That particular year, there had been a promise made to a mother. He'd told her he would bring a turkey over on Thanksgiving morning, fresh and ready, so she could have it stuffed and roasting in the oven by dinner time. But rather than making a simple grocery store run, the two friends decided to do things the fun way, turn the whole thing into a proper hunting trip and save themselves a few dollars in the process. 2 birds, 1 stone, as it were. He had an old 1978 Ford F-150 at the time. A total rust bucket by most people's standards, but tough as an old boot and reliable as the sunrise, which was really all that mattered. So after loading it up with their shotguns, a cooler full of cold beers and cold cuts, and everything else they needed for a long morning in the woods, they hit the road before the sun had even thought about rising. They headed east, out into the countryside, chasing the dark. They got to their planned parking spot just after dawn, the end of a dirt road that petered off into a thick wall of trees. They had hunted that same area the year before and knew it well. Belmont County has this wonderful mix of rolling hills and dense oak forest, and those oak trees meant one very important thing: acorns. Plenty of them. Dropping to the ground all season, fattening up the local turkeys in a way that gave the birds a deep, rich, natural flavor that you simply cannot find in any store-bought bird. Not even close. They walked in together, talking and laughing quietly, sipping on coffee as the woodland around them woke up and the birds started making their morning noise. About a mile in, they threw together a hunting blind using some camouflage netting and a collection of large fallen branches, enough cover to keep them well hidden from anything passing through. He had a box call with him, one his grandfather had actually carved by hand, and for the first hour or so he kept working it, letting out slow, careful yelps and soft clucking sounds, trying his best to sound like a lonely young hen looking for company. The most they got for all that effort was a few squirrels rustling through the leaf litter and the occasional snort of a deer somewhere off in the trees. Josh, being Josh, cracked a joke about how they'd probably end up having to shoot a possum and call it a turkey when they finally showed up at Mama's house for dinner. But then, not even a couple of minutes after that little joke, the first gobble rolled in from somewhere over a nearby ridge. After what felt like a very cold and very long stretch of sitting still and waiting, they finally spotted a small flock picking their way through the underbrush about 50 yards ahead of them, scratching at the ground and moving closer with every passing moment, completely unaware that two very eager hunters were sitting right there behind all that camo netting. The excitement was immediate and real, the kind that hits you right in the chest and makes you feel like a kid again. They watched and they waited. And then, right when the moment was perfect, the shot went up. A 12 gauge, and a clean, solid hit, one turkey dropped like a stone. Josh got another. But the bigger bird, a proud, strutting tom with his feathers fanned and his beard swinging, was the one that went down with a single pull of the trigger, collapsing in a burst of feathers. A few celebratory high fives later, they got to work dragging the birds back to the truck, no small workout, as anyone who has hauled a large turkey through the woods will tell you. Then they started the field dressing right there on the spot, wanting to get it done before the sun climbed any higher and the warmth started doing what warm air always does to fresh poultry, which, as was noted with characteristic bluntness, is not pleasant. Josh started talking about how gutting turkeys made him wish they'd just gone fishing instead, how it was easier to clean certain kinds of fish than it was to get the wrapper off a Slim Jim. That made his buddy laugh out loud, and he turned to ask just what kind of Slim Jims Josh had been eating. But the words never made it out of his mouth. Because before he even opened it, a bullet flew directly over both their heads, and the sharp crack of a gunshot split the quiet morning air wide open. Something, a tree, most likely, stopped the bullet. There was a hard, hollow thunk somewhere behind them. Both men froze completely. For a second, neither of them moved a muscle. He couldn't imagine why anyone would shoot in their direction, so his first instinct was that it had to be an accident, some careless hunter who hadn't paid proper attention to where his muzzle was pointing. He shouted something out into the trees. Something along the lines of "What on earth and hey, watch where you're aiming." He expected to hear an embarrassed apology come back at him from whoever was out there. Instead, there was nothing. No voice. No rustling footsteps. No sound at all except the wind pushing dead leaves along the ground. And then a second shot cracked through the air, this one even closer than the first. A clump of dirt kicked up from the ground no more than 3 feet from Josh's boot. Both men screamed and ran hard for the truck, throwing themselves behind it for cover. For one desperate second he thought about making a dash for his shotgun, which was leaning against a nearby log. But he quickly and correctly decided that running out into the open was not a move he was willing to make. They stayed crouched low and still, hoping that whoever was out there didn't have a clean angle on the truck. Josh tried desperately to work out where the shots were coming from. After a few breathless seconds, they pieced it together, whoever it was wasn't behind them. He was somewhere out in front of them, on the other side of the truck. The best they could do was try to catch a muzzle flash in the truck's side mirror if the shooter decided to fire again. Josh leaned down at one point, trying to get a look under the truck, and got himself told in no uncertain terms to stop being foolish before he got himself shot. He then reached for his gun, and the moment he did, his buddy thought for sure he was about to watch his best friend take a bullet. But Josh managed to grab it without the shooter firing a third time. That small mercy gave them something to hold on to. Maybe the shooter had run off. Maybe he was out of rounds. After another couple of tense, silent minutes, they made the call. They counted off a quiet 3, scrambled to their feet, threw themselves into the truck, and took off down the dirt road as fast as that old rust bucket would carry them. The half-dressed turkeys were left right where they lay. The truck doors weren't even fully closed. He leaned low in the seat as he drove, not wanting to be visible through the windshield, his whole body braced for the sound of a shot hitting metal. It never came. Just the roar of the engine and the sound of dirt and gravel flying out behind the tires. They didn't ease up until they hit the highway. And even then, it took another couple of miles before their hearts began to slow down to something resembling normal. They drove straight to the county sheriff's office, so wound up on adrenaline and disbelief that neither of them thought to wash the turkey blood off their hands before walking through the door. One of the deputies took one look at the two of them and later admitted he'd briefly and genuinely thought they had come in to confess to a murder. He said he'd never felt more relieved in his career than when they explained it was turkey blood and he spotted the little white feathers caked in the mud on their boots. After cleaning up as best they could in the department bathroom, they sat down and walked the deputy through the whole ordeal from beginning to end. It had a dreamlike quality to it, the way everything had happened so fast, the way it made so little sense, the way describing it all out loud felt almost like talking about something that had happened to someone else entirely. The deputy took their statements carefully, asked a series of questions mostly focused on exact location, and promised to send a patrol out to investigate. His best guess, he said, was that it was either a stray bullet or some fool playing a very stupid game. To the two hunters, it had felt far more deliberate and far more personal than that. But they also trusted that the sheriff's department was better equipped to investigate than they were, so they let it go and drove off to find some coffee at a gas station. Josh talked his buddy out of going back to retrieve his shotgun. Which, looking back, was probably the single wisest decision either of them made that entire day. Because when the deputies did go back out a couple of days later, they found the two half-dressed turkeys still laying right where they'd been left. But the shotgun was gone. Somebody had taken it. And that detail, that someone had been out there watching, had seen two men scramble for their lives and drive away in terror, and had then calmly walked up to where they'd been crouching and helped themselves to a gun, was the part that made the whole thing go from frightening to deeply, deeply unsettling. His mother ended up buying a store-bought turkey that Thanksgiving. He said it tasted like cardboard. And there was a heaviness to the whole thing, a feeling that something had been lost that went beyond two birds and a shotgun. But he didn't fully understand what they had really walked away from until roughly 3 years later. If something in this story has already got you sitting up a little straighter, you're not alone. If you've ever had a moment in the outdoors that didn't sit right with you, share it in the comments below, we want to hear from you. And if you're finding this one gripping, please do share it with someone who appreciates a story that gets under your skin. In the summer of 1993, a man named Thomas Dillon was convicted of 5 murders, all committed across eastern and southern Ohio. It was enormous news, the kind that dominates local headlines for weeks. But for these two friends, it wasn't the number of victims or even the geographic locations that made their blood run cold. It was the method. Because Thomas Dillon didn't stab his victims. He didn't beat them. He shot them, from a distance, with a long rifle, as though he were hunting them like animals. He heard it from Josh before he put it together himself. Josh called him, and it was the only time in his life that he could say his legs genuinely turned to jelly just from the sound of a voice on the telephone. He remembers sitting down slowly on the couch with the phone in his hand, his brain trying to process the reality of it, that they had been shot at by a serial killer. That they could have been 2 of his victims. What made it even more staggering was the timing. Because roughly 4 or 5 days after their hunting trip, Thomas Dillon killed a young man not far from the same area, someone just a few years younger than they were. And the reach of Dillon's destruction didn't stop at the people he actually killed. There was strong evidence suggesting he had also killed 2 hunters up in Michigan in that same year of 1992, evidence so compelling that another person who had been falsely convicted of those murders was eventually released from prison after spending 18 years locked away for something he did not do. 18 years. For a crime committed by a man who was still out there, still hunting people like turkeys in the autumn woods. That is the kind of thing that never stops being extraordinary in the worst possible way. The idea that this man destroyed lives he had never even been near, strangers who simply had the terrible misfortune of crossing paths with someone who saw other human beings as prey. And that by some grace of luck or timing or God or whatever you choose to believe in, these two young men in that old rust bucket made it out. Our next story comes from a man who grew up in a small town in Barber County, West Virginia, during the late 1950s and early 1960s. And like so many small communities in that part of the country during that era, life there had a particular texture, very poor, very family-centered, and deeply rooted in faith. People kept backyard vegetable patches. They made their own wine and their own liquor. And if meat was going to make it onto the dinner table, more often than not, someone in the family was going out into the woods to put it there themselves. In the towns of Bellington and Alluston, hunting wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life, a tradition carried forward from the hardships of the Great Depression, and a genuine rite of passage for young men growing up there. Boys were taught hunting safety practically from the time they started school, including the absolute rule that you never went out into the woods during hunting season without a strip of blazing orange somewhere on your upper body. And there was a deep, sincere respect in that community for the men who put themselves out there, sometimes in the cold, sometimes in the rain, to put food on the table for their families and neighbors. So when two hunters from around Bellington went missing when this man was just 12 years old, the weight of it was felt by the whole community immediately and profoundly. His father joined one of the search parties. The two missing men were regular hunting partners, everyone called them Mo and Larry, a nickname that came with a joke about the two stooges, since there was no Curly between them. But nobody made that joke after they disappeared. After that, they were just poor Mo and Larry. Just those missing hunters. Men from all across Barber County organized 3 separate search efforts, each one combing the wooded hills near a place known as Stringtown. And after all of that, all the hours and the boots and the determination, not a single trace of either man was ever found. The community prayed for them every Sunday. They prayed that Mo and Larry would come home safe and sound. That they'd walk back into town one day with some story that explained everything. But slowly, as the months stretched on, the hope got quieter. And the truth that people had been trying not to think about started taking up more and more space. As a child, he found the whole thing deeply confusing. There was no sign of what anyone would call foul play, which kept hope alive longer than it might have otherwise. And because the searchers hadn't found any bodies, there was a period where people talked as though Mo and Larry had simply decided to go somewhere, as though they'd packed a bag and left. Which made no sense to a child and, honestly, not much more sense to the adults either. There were rumors, of course. The kind that people whispered rather than said out loud. None of them fit quite right. None of them explained anything satisfactorily. And then one day, a small memorial appeared outside the church. And on 2 consecutive weekends, Mo and Larry's families appeared dressed in black. One week they were just missing, the next, they were being mourned as though it was certain they were never coming back. He was older by then, and he learned that the families had made the legal decision to have Mo and Larry declared dead in absentia, a painful but necessary step for financial and legal reasons that required the families to formally let go of the hope they had been holding onto for years. It was like a second wave of grief crashing over the whole town. One that felt different from the first, heavier, maybe, because this time there was no uncertainty to soften the edges. What gutted people most was the thought of the children left behind. Mo and Larry between them had left 2 widows and 5 children without fathers. Watching those kids carry that grief, watching so much hope be taken away from them after it had been the thing keeping them warm, twisted people up inside something fierce. And that pain curdled, the way grief sometimes does, into anger. Into blame. Into bitterness. At a town meeting, someone suggested that the volunteer search teams hadn't done their jobs properly. And that was all it took for things to get very heated, very fast. His father, watching it all from the porch that night, switched from beer to whiskey and talked to anyone who would listen about how something had always felt wrong about the way those searches went. Mo and Larry should have been found. People don't just disappear from the woods like that without leaving something behind. It was, his father said, like they had just climbed into a truck and driven away. Which wasn't impossible. But the question of why they would do that, why two men with wives and children and lives that mattered to them would simply vanish without even a note on the kitchen table, was one that nobody could answer in any way that felt satisfying. Some of the uglier rumors suggested things about Mo and Larry's personal lives that people in that community found uncomfortable to discuss openly, and so those possibilities were treated like something radioactive, something you stepped around rather than examined. But others, his father among them, had a darker and more frightening theory. One that involved Mo and Larry being forced into a vehicle against their will. At gunpoint. Because according to his father, and he made this argument many times, in various states of sobriety, there was no version of reality in which either of those men willingly abandoned their families. Not without a word. Not without a sign of some kind. And if they'd been killed out in those woods, there should have been evidence of it. A scrap of clothing. Something. His father and the other men in those search parties had turned over every leaf and looked under every stone. Twice. And they found absolutely nothing. It was a sorrowful, unresolved thing that hung over Bellington for years and years. The kind of wound a community carries without ever fully healing. And then, out of nowhere, the county sheriff paid a visit to Mo and Larry's widows and started asking questions about two farmers over in Tucker County. The widows didn't know what he was talking about and had nothing useful to offer. But when they pressed him on whether there had been any new developments in the search for their missing husbands, the sheriff was vague and dismissive, just making inquiries, he said, just talking to some farmers. He was not just talking to some farmers. He and the Tucker County Sheriff's Office were in the process of digging up a hog farm owned by two brothers. It took a few days for the word to spread. But when it did, someone drove over from Alluston to see it for themselves, and sure enough, there were the police, stripped to the waist, shoveling their way through enormous piles of dirt with pickaxes and spades. Looking for something. And by that point, given everything that had happened, it was not hard to guess what. But the sheriff's department refused to make any official statements about what they were doing or why. And back in Bellington, people were furious. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what kind of tip had led law enforcement to invest that level of effort into digging up someone's hog farm. The silence from the authorities stretched on for weeks. And when the Barber County Sheriff finally broke it, he managed to say almost nothing at all. An anonymous tip, he said. And the dig had turned up nothing. That was that. Nobody believed him. Nobody believed that an operation of that scale had been launched on nothing more than an anonymous tip that led nowhere. But the authorities would not be moved. There was nothing more to investigate, they said. More information would be shared when there was more information to share. There never was. Mo and Larry, their bodies, any trace of them, any explanation of what happened to them on that hunting trip, none of it was ever found. And the mystery of those two missing men stayed draped over the town of Bellington for as long as this man lived there. And since he doesn't imagine anyone has ever truly forgotten about them, he doesn't imagine that dark cloud has cleared away any time since. Our next account takes us somewhere very different, and something about it has stayed with people who were there for more than 3 decades. The man telling this story joined the British Army at 18 years old, on what he describes as very much a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had fallen in with a bad group of friends back home, and after nearly dying in a drunk driving incident one night, he understood clearly that his life needed to change direction. It was his father who talked him into enlisting, with the simple promise that the army would give him discipline, fitness, a wage, and a chance to shoot guns. That was, as he puts it, all he needed to hear. He became an infantryman with the Cheshire Regiment, stepping into service at the very tail end of the Cold War, when everything was focused on the threat from the Soviet Union. But then the USSR collapsed, and suddenly the threat evaporated. For young soldiers like him, it genuinely seemed like the rest of their careers might unfold in peacetime. That optimism didn't last long. Because not even a year after the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia began to tear itself apart. Yugoslavia was a country composed of many different peoples who had, for decades, been held together by the force of a dictatorship. Once that dictatorship fell, everything that had been suppressed came rushing to the surface, and the results were catastrophic. There were massacres, sieges, bombings, and a level of violence against civilians that shocked the world. The United Nations eventually decided to send in a peacekeeping force. And that is how this soldier found himself in Sarajevo. Sarajevo was the largest city in Bosnia, a city of hundreds of thousands of people. When the war broke out, it was immediately encircled by Serbian forces who attempted to take the city by force. The assault failed because the Bosnian defenders outnumbered the attacking forces significantly. So instead of capturing the city, the Serbian forces settled in around it and began a siege that would not lift for nearly 4 years. By the time British peacekeepers arrived, Sarajevo had become one of the most dangerous places on the face of the earth. Rocket and mortar barrages came in constantly, and went out, too, since the Bosnian defenders were fighting back. Sniper duels between Serbian and Bosnian fighters played out across rooftops and through broken windows. Water and electricity were sometimes cut off for weeks at a stretch, which in the heat of summer made the city almost unbearable in every sense. It was, by any honest description, hell on earth. And it was impossible for any human being with a heart to witness what the civilians of that city were enduring without feeling it deeply. People lost family members every single day. A single Serbian mortar shell dropped into a crowded marketplace killed and wounded more than 200 people in one instant. And the Serbian snipers were, in some ways, even more horrifying, because they made no distinction between soldiers and civilians. If they could see you, they considered you fair game. He watched a Serbian sniper shoot down a lone elderly woman as she tried to cross a street. The shelling was terrifying, but the old Soviet artillery equipment the Serbs were using was not particularly accurate. The snipers, especially the skilled ones, were a different matter entirely. They could get far closer than the mortar crews, and roughly half the time, if a good sniper had you in his sights, you weren't walking away from it. It's a story about one of those snipers, or rather, about what his section discovered about a particular sniper, that brings us here. In April of 1993, his section was assigned to guard a specific intersection in the city, operating out of 2 armored vehicles. Duty like that is typically tedious. This assignment was anything but. In addition to the roughly 300 artillery and mortar shells that landed in Sarajevo on a daily basis, the snipers in their area were extraordinarily bold. While his section was relatively protected inside their armored vehicles, the city's civilians, particularly the elderly and infirm, were desperately exposed. Part of their job was to provide mobile cover to any civilian caught in sniper fire, and where possible, without putting innocent lives at further risk, to return fire until the shooting stopped and the sniper retreated. Over time, working from the locations of firing points and the caliber of ammunition being used, his section managed to identify 4 distinct snipers operating in their area. It wasn't a foolproof method, they weren't calling them by name, but it gave them a working understanding of who they were dealing with. So when a new gunman opened up on them from a completely unfamiliar firing point in a derelict high-rise building, they quickly concluded that a new player had entered the game. And this new shooter, whoever he was staggeringly bad at his job. The first shot was so far off that they weren't even certain it had been directed at them at all. It wasn't until the second shot landed noticeably closer that they realized they were actually the intended target. They returned fire, located the firing position, put some machine gun rounds into the building, and things went quiet. The next day, the same thing happened again, same building, same terrible aim. They were almost embarrassed for whoever was up there pulling the trigger. But on the third day, this new sniper shifted targets. Instead of shooting at the armored vehicles, he began firing at civilians. At that point, one car stayed back to provide cover while the other moved toward the derelict apartment building to flush him out. Our narrator was in the car that stayed behind, so he didn't witness what happened next firsthand, but the lads who went into that building found the abandoned apartment the sniper had been using. The casings were all over the floor. A small hole had been knocked in the wall, positioned perfectly to overlook the checkpoint below. The sniper himself was gone, but the firing point had been carefully chosen, which meant that despite the terrible marksmanship, this person had enough knowledge to pick a tactically sound position. It was only a matter of time before a bullet from that spot found its mark. Recognizing the ticking clock nature of the situation, their sergeant requested permission from the troop commander to set up a covert listening post in an adjacent flat within the high-rise. A team could slip up there before dawn, take a concealed position, and wait. When the sniper returned and opened fire, they would be right there to respond. The commanding officer gave the green light, and the section was delighted. They had been sitting in those armored vehicles absorbing fire for weeks with very little to show for it. Getting a chance to actively do something about it was deeply satisfying. The next morning, only one armored vehicle was fully staffed at the checkpoint. The men from the other car were already upstairs in the listening post, hidden and waiting. The section on the ground checked in periodically by radio. Then, around 11 in the morning, the radio operator up in the listening post began tapping on his receiver. Nobody needed to decode the message to understand what it meant. Someone was in that building with them. The tension was sharp and immediate. Then the shooting started. Then it stopped. And when word came back over the radio that none of their men had been hurt, the relief was physical. The team in the high-rise had taken down 2 of the 3 members of a sniper team, most likely affiliated with a Serbian militia, based on their appearance and equipment. The third man, who turned out to be unarmed, dropped to his knees and begged for his life. Recognizing that a live prisoner was considerably more useful than a dead one, the lads brought him back to the checkpoint with his hands bound behind his back. But before they did that, they searched the bodies of the 2 men who had been killed. They found money, cigarettes, lighters, the ordinary things a person carries. And then, in the pocket of one of the dead men, they found a passport. An Italian passport. They compared the photograph to the dead man's face carefully. There was no doubt about it. The deceased man appeared to be an Italian national, and nothing about his name suggested Serbian heritage. The captured Serbian prisoner was carrying a significant amount of cash. Initially the section assumed the Italians might have been mercenaries of some kind. But once they secured a Serbian-speaking translator and persuaded their prisoner, with some cigarettes, water, and a bit of food, to talk, what came out was something none of them had anticipated. The 2 Italians had not been mercenaries. They had been clients. They had been paying the Serbs for the opportunity to shoot at United Nations soldiers and Bosnian civilians. The translator, who had maintained a professional neutral expression throughout, visibly faltered at this point. She was asked to confirm it. She did. What the Serbian prisoner was describing, as incredible as it was to process, was something that could only be called war tourism. The prisoner said he had no choice in the matter, that he was following orders from his commander and would have faced serious consequences for refusing. He couldn't tell them much about the 2 Italians beyond the fact that they had arrived with a great deal of money and absolutely no military knowledge whatsoever. When all of it was brought to the troop commander, along with the Italian passport as evidence, he was as stunned as everyone else. But as shocking as it was. One man's testimony and one passport, possibly forged, was nowhere near enough to formally prove a charge as extraordinary as war tourism. And to further complicate matters, it wasn't even clearly a war crime under the definitions that existed. The troop commander decided against recovering the 2 bodies from the building. If those men really had been paying to kill civilians, they had received the most fitting punishment imaginable. And if their passports turned out to be genuine, there was little chance the Italian government would want to claim them publicly anyway. So it stayed exactly where it was, classified officially as nothing more than rumor. For more than 30 years, that is exactly where it remained. And then, just recently, an old military friend forwarded him an article from Al Jazeera. He says his jaw nearly hit the floor. An Italian journalist had spent years gathering evidence of what he was calling sniper safaris, organized opportunities, advertised in the darker corners of Italian society, likely with mafia involvement, through which wealthy individuals paid what would today amount to approximately €100,000, or around $120,000, for the chance to travel to Sarajevo and shoot at people. According to the article, they were not the only soldiers to have noticed it. A Bosnian intelligence officer had apparently contacted his Italian counterparts at some point and asked them to put a stop to it. People inside the city had long suspected that some of the snipers targeting them were not Serbian soldiers at all, that they were foreigners who had paid for the privilege of killing them. One detail in the article was particularly chilling. Local observers had noticed that sniper activity seemed to increase reliably on weekends. Which suggests a pattern: people flying in on a Friday, spending the weekend shooting at civilians from a bombed-out high-rise, and flying home on Sunday evening. The article mentioned an unnamed plastic surgeon who was said to have done precisely that in 1993, the same year this soldier was stationed there. He makes it clear that he doesn't have much sympathy for anyone who paid for one of those so-called safaris and didn't make it home. It was them that were being shot at. But even so, having something he had always half-believed confirmed after all this time gave him complicated feelings. Because there is something particularly disturbing about people who look at a city full of suffering human beings and see an opportunity. Not just to profit from war, though that is terrible enough, but to look at a stranger, a real person living a real life, and decide to end it. And then fly home. And carry on as normal. Our next story takes us somewhere else entirely, to the Congo, to a family's hidden history, and to the question of whether some truths are better left buried. The person sharing this account is a Belgian man named Laurent, from the city of Charleroi. He wants to be clear from the outset that what he is sharing is not a personal story of something frightening that happened to him directly. It is a story about someone he loved, his grandfather, a man named Leandro, and it is a story that frightens him deeply to think about, even now. Leandro was born in 1899. He grew up in Belgium, received a solid education, worked on his own father's farm, and had plans to attend university with the goal of becoming a doctor. The First World War disrupted those plans, though he was too young to serve in it. When the Second World War broke out, he volunteered as a junior officer. But Germany's invasion of Belgium was swift and overwhelming, and his unit was overrun before it could mount any real resistance. He fled to Britain and became part of the Free Belgian Forces, men who continued fighting for their country from abroad while their homeland was occupied. His great dream was to be part of the army that eventually liberated Belgium. Instead, the government in exile had other ideas and sent him to the Belgian Congo. Despite Belgium itself being under German occupation, the Congo remained in Free Belgian hands, and the colonial administration was in desperate need of capable people. Leandro became one of them. He traveled to the Congo in 1940 and spent 5 years there, living and working in a world entirely unlike anything he had known back home. And when the war ended and it came time to return, he refused. He told his family that he had found not just a second home but a livelihood he loved, and he intended to stay. He established himself as a hunting guide, based in Kisangani, a city in the eastern portion of the Congo's vast central basin, surrounded by dense jungle and rainforest. Wealthy Belgian and French hunters would travel there and pay generously for a guide who could lead them safely through the jungle in pursuit of forest buffalo, the red-coated bongo antelope, or the semi-aquatic sitatunga. Leandro was an enthusiastic hunter himself, both at home and in Africa, and he had taken considerable risks in service of his country. A life of passion and profit seemed, by his own accounting, richly deserved. He built the business into something genuinely impressive, hosting prominent Belgian and French celebrities, diplomats, and foreign dignitaries. He threw lavish parties with drinks and dancing after returning from the hunting grounds, and the photographs from that era, many of which his grandson has seen, show a man radiating happiness. Fun-loving, warm, apparently not inclined toward seriousness in any direction. That era ended in 1960, when a prolonged period of violent political upheaval culminated in Congolese independence from colonial rule. Many Belgians returned to their homeland. Leandro was among them. But the man who came back was not the man who had left. His daughter and son, Lauren's father and aunt, were adults by the time of their father's return and no longer living at home, but they heard from their mother, Leandro's wife, about what had happened to him. Gone was the sociable, party-loving hunter. In his place was a man who was withdrawn, bitter, and deeply troubled. He shut himself in his study for days at a time, barely emerging, taking his meals and his sleep right there among his books and maps. For months, this was his life, immersed in study, poring over documents, barely speaking to anyone. Eventually, Leandro shared what was consuming him with his wife. A business partner of his had gone missing in the field. The political upheaval of Congolese independence had made organizing a search from thousands of miles away enormously difficult, and the whole process was clearly taking a devastating toll on him. His wife didn't press him for details. But as the search stretched through 1961 and into 1962, it became clear to everyone that they were no longer looking for a living man. They were searching for whatever remained of one. And then, in early 1963, something changed. Leandro became suddenly and intensely energized. He had obtained new information, he said, about where his partner might be found. He flew to the Congo within weeks and spent approximately 10 weeks deep in the jungle, searching. His wife prayed every night for his success. When he failed and came home empty-handed, she prayed that he would find a way to make peace with it. He did not make peace with it. What began in the aftermath of that final failed search was something his wife and children could only describe as a transformation into madness. Leandro began importing religious objects from the Langa tribes of the eastern Congo, specifically, small carved figures called minkisi. He imported them by the dozen. Lauren has seen them with his own eyes. And these are not decorative objects. In Congolese spiritual tradition, a nkisi is understood to function almost like a portable grave. If soil from a deceased person's burial site is passed over or placed within the figure, it becomes a vessel for that person's spirit, allowing the soul to travel wherever the object goes. Leandro had these figures installed over windows and doorways throughout his house, though he never explained whether their purpose was to keep something inside the house or to keep something outside of it. He also oversaw the construction of what he called an ancestral altar in his study, and this one he did explain. He kept it stocked with offerings, fresh water, fruits, ritual items. He drew symbols on it in red chalk, intending to invite the spirits of the dead to linger there and provide him with guidance. He placed bowls of river stones throughout the house. He had a pond dug on his property specifically so that the Simbi spirits, water spirits in Congolese tradition, believed to guard the natural world and shepherd souls between life and death, might make a home there. The figures of Simbi appeared on fountains, on bird baths, and even on some of the water taps in the house. It was, as Lauren reflects, their reputation for warning of danger that seemed to occupy his grandfather's mind most urgently. This is how Leandro lived out his final years. Fixed on an ancient religious tradition, sequestered in his study like a wealthy hermit, surrounded by symbols and altars and spirit vessels. His wife told Lauren that at first the chalk symbols appeared only around the ancestral altar. But as his health deteriorated and death drew closer, they began appearing elsewhere in the house, on walls, on doorframes. In other rooms, with increasing frequency. And these later symbols were drawn only in white, not red, because white in this tradition signifies communication with the spirit world. The presence of owls on the property frightened him terribly in those final months. He believed sincerely that they were omens of death coming for him. In the days before he died, Leandro grew increasingly agitated and disoriented. He began demanding that his wife bring him a nana, a traditional Congolese spiritual practitioner, to perform death rites on him. His wife was heartbroken, convinced her husband's mind had completely broken. But she honored his wish, and found a nana, an elderly Congolese woman living in Brussels, and brought her to the house. His wife had braced herself for the old woman's presence to make things worse. Instead, the opposite happened. Whatever the Nana said to Leandro, whatever rituals she performed in that study, it brought a frightened and unraveling man to complete stillness. The transformation was so total that his wife described it simply as a miracle. He was calm. He was present. He was, for the first time in years, at peace. A few days later, he died. Lauren was in his early 20s when his grandfather passed. Until that point, the family had managed his exposure to the truth of Leandro's condition carefully, describing him to the children simply as eccentric and unwell. But once his grandfather was gone and his grandmother was no longer able to maintain their protective story, everything came out in the span of about a week. A whirlwind of revelations that left Lauren with far more questions than answers. He spent years afterward researching his grandfather's beliefs, reading about Congolese spiritual traditions, trying to understand what Leandro had encountered and why it had transformed him so completely. But for every question he managed to answer, 3 more appeared in its place. Because the most critical piece of information, what actually happened to Leandro's missing business partner, a South African man named Francis, is entirely absent from the historical record. Leandro was a meticulous documentarian. Lauren has seen the photo albums, the expedition records, the diaries of his Congo years. There are maps and invoices and detailed accounts of hunting trips going back decades. But when it comes to Francis's disappearance, or to the 10-week search expedition Leandro made in 1963, nothing. Not a single note. Not one diary entry. The records simply stop. And then they begin again, with a different man writing them. Lauren believes that understanding what happened during that expedition is essential to understanding everything that followed. But in the absence of any documentation, he finds himself left with only imagination, and imagination, in this case, leads to very dark places. His grandfather was, by all accounts, a great man. A man who had loved life and laughed easily and built something remarkable out of courage and passion. Something happened to one of his oldest friends in the jungle of the Congo. And Lauren doesn't think it was the mystery of it that broke his grandfather's mind. He thinks it was the truth. He thinks that something happened out there, something so far beyond the ordinary, so far outside the world as his grandfather understood it, that only the comfort of an ancient and sacred belief system could provide any relief from what he had witnessed. And as much as Lauren wants to know the truth, he finds himself, more and more often, asking a different question entirely. Does he really want to? We'd love to know which of these stories has gotten under your skin the most so far. Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts and reactions are one of our favorite parts of making these videos. And if you're enjoying this one, please do take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a deeply unsettling true story. Our final account for tonight comes from someone who has worked for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for nearly 10 years. She loves her job, but she will be the first to tell you that it's not always easy. Her agency is responsible for managing the state's wildlife and the habitats those animals depend on. They issue licenses to hunters who meet safety and responsibility standards, produce educational materials covering hunting and boating safety, and run conservation programs designed to protect Arkansas's natural environments for future generations. But there is a darker dimension to the work as well. Wildlife officers investigate animal attacks and accidents, tree stand falls, equipment failures, and worse. In cases involving criminal negligence that result in serious injury or death, the agency coordinates directly with local law enforcement for a more thorough investigation. Over nearly a decade, she has been involved in roughly 24 such investigations. Every single one of them, every case involving serious injury or the loss of a human life, took a toll on her, both physically and mentally. But there is only one incident she has ever investigated that still gives her chills when she thinks back on it. Even now, all these years later. Just over 6 years ago, the Marion County Sheriff's Department called the agency with a report of a hunting accident near a small community called Yellville. Hunting accidents are, thankfully, relatively rare, so the call itself was enough to put everyone on alert. But once the details came through, people were picking their jaws up off the floor. Two experienced hunters had been tracking a mature buck for several hours. They had noticed, as they followed it, that it seemed to be behaving in a slightly unusual way, a little off, a little unpredictable, but nothing dramatic enough to give them pause. They kept on its trail until they had a clear, good shot. One of the hunters lined up his sights and fired. The buck went down. And this is where it is important to understand that these were not reckless men. Experienced hunters know that a downed deer is not automatically a safe deer. A stunned animal can regain consciousness suddenly, and a fully grown buck with a set of antlers is not something you want lurching back to its feet while you're standing 2 feet away from it. The standard safety guidance is to wait at least 20 to 30 minutes after a kill before approaching, depending on the animal's size and where the shot landed. These two hunters followed that guidance exactly. They waited the full 30 minutes. Then they approached slowly, stood over the animal, and satisfied themselves beyond any reasonable doubt that it was not breathing. Then one of them knelt down to take a photograph. The buck that they were certain was dead leapt to its feet and attacked the kneeling hunter with ferocious force. 3 severe puncture wounds, to the stomach and to the chest. His partner didn't have time to shoulder his rifle and take aim. The chaos of the moment was too close, too sudden, and too fast. Fortunately, the buck bolted immediately after goring the man to the ground and did not return. His partner's shot missed. The animal disappeared into the trees. The injured hunter was airlifted to hospital, where surgeons managed to save his life. It was described by more than one person as nothing short of a miracle, given the damage those antlers had caused. But it was the mystery, not the miracle, that kept people up at night. She was one of the wildlife officers dispatched to the scene following the incident. It was eerie out there, the particular heaviness of a place where something violent and inexplicable has just occurred. But since the buck had already been shot once at close range, they expected to find it laid out dead somewhere within a reasonable distance. A deer shot through both lungs, as the hunter described, cannot typically survive long enough to travel very far. Half a mile at the outside, in most cases. They searched for hours. In every direction. Over a considerable area. They found nothing. No body. No blood trail. No sign that the animal had passed through at all. That finding made no sense. None. And as the search continued without result, the wildlife officers began to feel, collectively, a deep and creeping unease, the particular chill that comes not from being frightened, exactly, but from being confronted with something that simply does not have an explanation. One of the follow-up tasks assigned to the team was to develop recommendations for how this kind of incident could be prevented in the future, how the agency's hunter education programs and habitat management strategies might be updated to help people avoid a similar situation. She sat down to write those recommendations and found herself completely unable to produce a single useful sentence. Because the two hunters had done everything right. They had followed every piece of guidance they had ever been given, to the letter, without shortcuts. There was nothing to tell them they should have done differently. There was no lesson to extract, no prevention strategy to build, no logical safety principle that would have changed the outcome. All that remained were questions. Unsettling, persistent, unanswerable questions about what that buck was, what had happened to it before the hunters ever found it, how it had survived a shot that should have been fatal, and where in the world it had gone after that. And sometimes, honestly, those are the worst kinds of stories. Not the ones where something terrible happens and there is a reason for it, a person responsible for it, a thread you can follow back to something that makes sense. The worst ones are the stories where everything a reasonable person knows to be true simply stops applying. Where the rules of the world as you understand it just quietly, inexplicably break down. And you're left standing in the woods with nothing but questions and the particular, hollow feeling of knowing that whatever the answer is, you may never find it. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. These stories stay with us long after the telling, and we think they'll stay with you too. If any of tonight's account struck a chord with you, if you've had an experience of your own that felt unexplainable, or dangerous, or strange in ways you still don't have words for, we genuinely want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. This community is made up of people who understand that kind of thing, and your story might mean more to someone reading it than you'll ever know. If you're new here, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And if you've been with us for a while, thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being here and for making this community what it is. What do you think was really out there in those Ohio woods in 1992? What do you think Leandro's grandfather actually found in the Congo? Leave your thoughts, your theories, and your guesses in the comments. We read every single one. And we will see you in the next one.